share my screen. Give me 1 second. Technology is amazing. However, it's lots of things that can go wrong. So hopefully I will share my talk now. Can you see this?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so now.
It's not in full screen. Now, okay.
Now it is.
Is it okay? Okay, so forgive me. I just had COVID last week, so I'm better, but I mean, my voice is a little bit bad. Right, so I'm very interested in this border area between psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. And one area of great interest is this question of free will. Can neuroscience help us understand this problem in a different way than philosophers have emphasized? And I think neuroscience and science can give us some useful information. And so I'm going to advocate essentially a type of libertarian position, namely that we do have free will. And then the question is how this might work in the brain. So let me just start with a basic idea that I called criterial causation. In 2012-13, I wrote this book. And it's really a book about the neural code. So the question is there a possibility for a neural code that would give us some kind of freedom? Typically, historically, people have said, well, there cannot be free will because if the universe is deterministic, well, then what you will decide was already predetermined before you were born. And other people would say at the other end, under indeterminism, your decisions are just random, and therefore, again, you have no control over how things will turn out. And I think there's a middle ground between these two positions, and I have called this criterial causation. It's really, I think, the idea of this person, who is a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, he didn't care about the neural code at all. He didn't think about neurons, but he thought about the definition of sets, criteria, right? So he asked questions like, what makes somebody look like a Finnish Laplander? Well, there's no fixed necessary condition or sufficient condition. There might be, say, 10 criteria. So Laplanders might tend to look, they might tend to be, say, short, but then you'd say, well, that one is tall. Well, they might tend to have dark hair. Well, that one has light hair. Well, they might tend to have a nose like this. Well, this one has a nose like that. So he said that to define any set, you have to define it criterially. So let's say I ask a question like, well, let's talk about Spanish people. What makes somebody look Spanish? Well, I'll say, well, they tend to have brown hair. Well, that one is blonde. Yeah. And so that's not necessary or sufficient. You can be blonde and not be Spanish, or you can be Spanish and be blonde or not blonde, right? But there's a kind of, he called it family resemblances. The set of people who look Spanish share something in common. Let's say there are 10 criteria. Well, this person might meet those 5, and that person might meet those 5, and that person might meet those 5. If you look at the whole set, there's a kind of fuzzy linkage, a family resemblance. Now, you can take that idea and apply it to defining what counts as a bird or what counts as a lamp, anything. So I think the neural code is essentially Wittgensteinian in that it is emphasizing the criteria for what count as something. So if I have a neuron or a population of neurons that are tuned to, say, a cat, they tend to fire more to a cat. Well, might be some criteria that say, they have this kind of eye and they have this kind of ear, but there's no necessary or sufficient defining characteristic for cats. Now, what makes the neural code criterial is that neurons can change each other's criteria for firing in the future. So traditionally, causation is thought of as something like energy impacting and passing energy. So this billiard ball hits this billiard ball and it passes its energy along. So this is a kind of Newtonian conception of information. This is a Newtonian conception of causation that is very common in the West. And it is an assumption about causation, namely causation as impact. So in this case, billiard ball B is hit by billiard ball A, and billiard ball B passively responds. Billiard ball B sets no criteria upon A. However, we can imagine criterial causation where B now sets criteria or places informational conditions on A for the release of B. For example, if A is striped, then do this. If A is an even number, do that. If A is solid, do that, right? So you can imagine now causation that emphasizes B's criteria placed upon A's input. And this essentially adds if-then statements, right? So in Newton's conception of information, of causation, there's no informational if-then statements. But biology is all about these informational if-then statements. So if you, I don't know, is my audience mostly philosophy or mostly neuroscience, Jose?
Interdisciplinary.
Okay, so I will, but you know, the dominant conception of causation now is, it's called a manipulationist or an interventionist approach to causation, and the leading thinkers are Jim Woodward and Judea Pearl. And I don't think they're incorrect. I think that their story is incomplete. So they say they're focused very much on manipulating something about A and then looking what happens with B. But what's missing from the interventionist story is the fact that we can intervene or change the criteria that B places upon A. And this will also change the nature of causation. Anyway, so the neural code, I think, is very much about action potentials, you know, coming down the axon and then making this neuron fire. That's a little bit like a Newtonian conception, billiard ball A causing billiard ball B to move. But causation among neurons is also about this neuron changing the conditions for making this neuron fire. So this neuron might rewire this neuron, and this neuron won't fire. It will do nothing, but it'll change its conditions. Maybe it'll go from being a neuron that fires to cats. It'll become a neuron that fires to dogs because you change the synaptic weights. So I won't get into the very details of how synaptic weights are changed, but I get into that into my book. So I think criterial causation, namely changing the conditions whereby B is released, is really at the center of this special class of physical causation that we call biology. And the essence of it is that B now is looking for certain patterns of input, certain patterns in the energy that's the input. And if those patterns are true, B will do something. So this is true at every level. So for example, take the top right. You can have a single channel. This is called an NMDA channel, and it's very central to the functioning of the brain. It is placing criteria upon its input. 3 things have to be true for it to open. Glucose has to bind to it. Another chemical called glycerine or glycine has to bind to it. And the postsynaptic neuron has to already be depolarized because other receptors called AMPA receptors have already opened. So this little tiny channel, the NMDA channel, is a coincidence detector. It's saying if this energy that has a certain shape binds, and if these 3 things are true in time, so it's a coincidence detector, then I will open and allow calcium to flow into the neuron, massively depolarizing it, making it fire with a special pattern, typically a bursty pattern. So that's true of channels. It's true of neurons on the upper left, right? A neuron is also a coincidence detector. It's saying, well, let's say I need 5 excitatory postsynaptic potentials to reach my threshold for firing. So they have to arrive within a small window, for most pyramidal cells, about 25 milliseconds. And so the neuron is also placing criteria, both in time, but also about the type of information. A cat detecting neuron might say, well, I need input from 2 eye detecting neurons and a mouth detecting neuron. If they arrive simultaneously on a triangular shape, then fire. Otherwise, don't fire. And criterial causation is also the case, even at the level of whole animals. So you can take an animal like a lamprey, and it's looking for certain kinds of fish. And if those conditions are true, it will try to attach itself to the fish, but it won't attach itself to a rock. So this criterial causation is everywhere in biology once you start looking. For example, some of the criteria I have are probably innate, right? So I'm heterosexual, so I was looking for a woman, but my biology didn't say I have to marry just this one woman, right? My criteria were broad, but not completely broad. I wanted certain things biologically. Probably the same things most people want: kindness, intelligence, beauty, health, basic things. But I was not attracted to, a cloud or a tree or fish, right? So my criteria at the level of selection 8 were, probably biologically given to some extent, but that doesn't mean there's a unique solution. There's not just one woman in all of history that I could have married. I mean, don't tell her. Anyway, so then, you have your criteria, and then there's a kind of threshold, right? And that threshold can go up, it can go down. Also, don't tell your wife or your husband that, you married them because they were the first one who was above threshold. Don't tell them. But anyway, this kind of chance or contingency is everywhere in our lives. Why did you marry this person versus that person? Well, maybe that day you turned left by accident. And then if you had turned right, you would have met somebody else and you would be married to them and maybe equally happy or equally unhappy. So contingency is everywhere once you allow selection to be criterial. Okay, so some criterial causation is not simply given by biology. It can be cognitive. So I can say, think of someone who has red hair, and you can think of lots of people. Here are some people I thought of. So that criterion, think of someone who has red hair, well, it's loose in the sense that there are many possible ways to meet this criterion. However, it's not random, right? Because they had to have red hair. So we are constantly setting up criteria for our own future solutions. And I want to argue that we're also constantly reparametrizing ourselves for future action. So I'm going to essentially advocate a kind of Aristotelian virtue ethics. For philosophers, that should make sense, in which we are changing our bodies, changing our nervous system to prepare for future decisions. And so this gives rise to the possibility of a kind of free will. I'll call this type 2 free will, where we can choose to become a new kind of chooser in the distal future. But let me unpack that a little bit. So we have to first make a distinction between different classes of free will. One is proximal free will. The other is distal free will. So proximal free will can involve picking, right? If I say, I want to pick an apple, I can pick any apple. It doesn't matter. They're all equivalent. But sometimes I have to choose, and I have to have some criteria, like I want to buy milk and I want it to be as cheap as possible and as, maybe organic and maybe local, right? I can have different criteria. So, but in each of these cases, whether I'm picking where things are equivalent or where things are not equivalent, where I'm choosing, still it's only about my immediate action. But then there's a kind of free will about the distant future. And this is quite different, I think. It's not simply about choosing right now, it's about choosing things that are way, way in the future, like I to learn how to speak, Mandarin. Well, I don't speak Mandarin, so what should I do to become a Mandarin speaker? It takes at least 3 years to become adequate at Mandarin. What should I do? I can go to the bookstore and get a book, right? So I can create a kind of plan. I can create a vision of what I want. Say, I want to learn how to speak Mandarin. Then I can say, okay, that's my goal. In 3 years, I want to be able to speak Mandarin. Okay, so I can go back to now, say, what do I need to do today to achieve this vision? Okay, I should go on Amazon and buy a book about how to speak Mandarin, or I should join a course about how to speak Mandarin. And then slowly over long periods of time, months, years even, I can slowly realize that vision. So that is a different kind of volition than simply choosing this milk versus this milk. This is really about imagining a future and then creating it slowly. So we'll call that distal free will. Okay, so I think we have a kind of free will in common with other animals. We'll call that first order free will. It's the ability to, well, I'll read this. If a mind can alter the probabilities of future events for its own reasons, and if it can knowingly choose among alternatives, some of which might really happen, then we can say this mind exhibits free agency or has a free will. So that will be my definition of free will. We can argue about that later. But basically, I can choose, I can shape probabilities through my present intentions and actions. So take an animal like this jaguar in Brazil. It's looking at this giant rodent called a capybara, and it can have a plan. It can say, okay, I see the capybara, and it has a kind of tree, like a Borges tree in its head of possibilities. Okay, maybe the capybara will go there, and if the capybara goes there, I'll go this way. Or it can say, well, I want to maximize speed, and I want to maximize sound and minimize effort. So it can weigh its options, and I think a jaguar can do this. Also, the capybara has an internal Borges tree of possibilities in its imagination. And then the jaguar chooses one path, and it chooses another path. And if it's successful, it kills the capybara. Now, this kind of freedom depends on a kind of imagination, even in a jaguar, and it has a branching set of possibilities in its head. And then there's the true possibilities, and ideally these should correspond, but there's no guarantee they correspond, and we can imagine things correctly or incorrectly. So you can imagine that evolution is also operating on the imaginative capacities of a jaguar, so that it imagines what really is possible as opposed to what is not possible. In this sense, I think most animals are very concrete. Yes, they have an imagination, but it's typically about what really could happen in their immediate world. But there can be correspondence or non-correspondence between imagined possibilities and actual possibilities. And so we're constantly involved in a dynamic loop between perception, imagining what might happen next, doing something, and then perceiving what happened. And so there's a feedback loop. So animals are typically in this dynamic feedback loop, and they're not necessarily imagining things that are happening counterfactually, or I don't think a jaguar thinks, I wonder what it's like to be an armadillo or a bear. Their imagination is in a way very concrete. Now, humans, I think, have a very different kind of imagination. We can imagine to become a new kind of chooser in the distal future. So I don't think a jaguar says to itself, next year I want to be a different kind of jaguar. I want to be a jaguar that eats fewer capybaras and eats more armadillo. Right? I think other animals are much more limited by their instinct. Now, humans can imagine distal futures in which they are actually very different. and then try to accomplish that. So I gave the example of imagining myself speaking Mandarin in 3 years, and I can slowly build myself towards that and become a new kind of nervous system, one that can process Mandarin. But I can also imagine quite radically different things. You know, I can imagine myself as a woman and say, okay, I want to become a woman. What kind of operations do I need to do? And then I could slowly become something that approximates my vision. And then the human imagination also allows us to imagine things that are simply impossible, right? Like I can imagine what it is like for me to fly around Mars. That's never going to happen. I can imagine what it's like to be a cat. That's also never going to happen, right? So I think our imagination is really the deep source of our free will. Our imagination has led to a really radical form of representation. And so one question is, you know, what goes into the construction of our kinds of imaginings that animals don't have? When I was living in Tübingen, I would go to Stuttgart and watch the bonobos. They're related to chimpanzees. And I would watch them and they would get rained on and they would look very unhappy. And I thought, you know what? Every human group will invent umbrellas or raincoats. And they just sit there in the rain and they do nothing. It's almost as if they cannot imagine a way out of the rain. But humans have this tremendous power of imagination that allows us to invent things like umbrellas. And I want to argue that this imaginative capacity is what makes us free in a way that other animals are not. We have this sort of second order free will that is not only about freedom of doing in the world as it is, it's about a freedom to change the world into something different or change ourselves into something different than exists now. So one question is how this began. Well, we know that your body is modular. So we have specialized organs, you know, and we have modularity because you need specialization. So if you had only one organ that pumped the blood and cleaned the blood and transferred oxygen, it would be bad at all those things. So you have specialization, a heart for pumping blood and so forth. And that's also true of the brain. We have a kind of mental modularity in the sense that we have specialized neural circuits that do particular things. And one argument is that we have a kind of Swiss Army knife modularity of function in our brains. I want to argue that there are certain functions that seem to be general. So if you read Fodor's book, Jerry Fodor's book called Mental Modularity, he says most mental modules are fast, dedicated, they run in parallel, and they are encapsulated. Their processing is separate from other modules. But he also in that book says there are some processes that seem to be non-modular or supermodular. I think he talks about reason, for example, being one capacity that seems to not be parallel, but serial, not be encapsulated, but domain general. And I think that there was a kind of breakdown of modularity in our lineage that led to our special kind of imagination. So volitional attention is another one of these domain general operators. So I could have you pay attention to the feeling of your shoes in your feet in your shoes. So your attention can attend to your body. Now pay attention to a picture of your grandmother. Poof, you can attend to your memories, right? So attention can go across modules. So, you know, what is attention? Well, one idea is that it is this kind of operation that links representations across modules. And this is Anne Treisman's notion of different modules or maps, one for color, one for orientation, and so forth. And if you attend to something, it links across those domains. Another idea of attention is that it functions as what's called an object file. This is her husband's idea, Danny Kahneman's idea. So if I'm attending to something, I say, oh, it's a bird. So I open up a kind of representation an object file in my working memory, and I say, oh, it's a bird. Oh, wait a second. No, it's not a bird. It's a plane. Oh, no, it's Superman, right? So everything changed about this thing. First, I thought it was a bird. Then I thought it was a plane. Then I said it was Superman. Its position changed. Its features changed. Everything changed. Its name changed. The only thing that didn't change was my representation of keeping track of something over time. And I want to argue that the attentional working memory representations for an animal are concrete, right? So if a monkey looks at a banana, it represents a banana. If I take a human and they look at a banana, well, that banana in its object file can hold the banana, but it can also hold other things, like it could also hold the place where I work. So now the banana represents where I work, or it can represent my son. It can point to anything. And so you can see how this change in our ability to hold things together in a working memory representation could lead to a radically new architecture, namely, in this case, one that is symbolic, right? So in addition to combining features or representations across modules, we can also liberate operations. So an operator that was dedicated to processing, say, visual patterns could now operate over my memories. Or an operator that's evaluating, for example, the fertility of potential mates could now operate not just on potential mates, but on sunsets. So now you have a kind of disencapsulation of operations. And this is a kind of promiscuity of our minds that I think the highly modular mind of a jaguar or a chimpanzee doesn't enjoy or suffer from. Because a chimpanzee's operators are stuck inside of its modules for which they evolve, but ours are freed to operate promiscuously. Now, I won't go into too much further detail, but I just want to indicate that I think that this kind of liberation of operations that occurred because of a breakdown of mental modularity gave rise to art, music, abstraction, syntax, metaphor, lots of things. Now, we can apply these operators volitionally as needed. So for example, you have the idea of a function. Well, usually a function does something, like there might be a function that rotates something in space. So I can take an object and then I operate on that object. So the object is my operand and the function is my operator, and I can rotate it, right? So we can now volitionally take some operand, like imagine your grandmother, and rotate her this way, then rotate her this way. And, you know, maybe you can do this to some extent. So imagine if all these operations that evolved for motoric reasons or for perceptual reasons now can be applied conceptually in this new domain of human freedom, namely freedom of the imagination. This will give us amazing freedom to invent new things, but will also cause problems. So suddenly now we're applying pattern operators from vision to domains where they didn't evolve to process, like our memories, and suddenly we see patterns in our life, or we become aware of death. Sorry, I still have a little bit of COVID. Okay, but this ability, this liberation of operators to domains or modules for which they did not evolve led to this tremendous freedom and many problems also in us. But what exactly do we mean by imagination? Well, you know, usually in my field of cognitive neuroscience, people talk about the nouns of the mind, faces, objects, scenes, and there's much less emphasis on operations, right? So rotating something, putting things together or taking them apart. There's lots of operations, many of which are spatial or temporal. And I won't get into this here, but I think many of them are actually motoric, where we learn to use our bodies, but now we're operating not on objects in the world, but on internal representations in our imagination. So I will define imagination as operations over operands in our internal mental workspace or virtual reality. And a lot of work in my lab has focused on how this works in the brain. I won't talk about that here, though. But let me just give you an example, right? So in 1903, these two men, Orville and Wilbur Wright, they ran a bicycle store in Dayton, Ohio, right? They were poor. They had only experience building bicycles, and they said, everybody has been trying to build, flying machines that are like birds, that are flapping, like an ornithopter. They said, well, why don't we do something different? Why don't we go into our bicycle shop and we will put a fan or a propeller on a wing? So nobody had done that before. So this involves an active imagination where you take something like a fan and you attach it to a wing. Then the question is, well, how do you do that? Well, that's not easy, but the active imagination didn't find an exact solution. It said, these are the criteria that we need to meet. There has to be a fan, sucking it forward, and a wing. So they built it. Two poor young men who nobody ever heard of before went into their bicycle shop and they built this crazy thing, and they made lots of mistakes. Lots of people got hurt. Then they tried again and they built a better version, and they got better and better. Here they are. And eventually, in 1903, they built one that worked for the first time. And they flew for the first time. It's not that long ago, right? This is 119 years ago. And think about how the world has changed. Versions got faster and better and higher. Lots of mistakes again. They tried again, they built something better, and eventually this became this. And now we have this, all in 119 years. This all began with an act of imagination where they carried out an operation. They attached a propeller to a wing, and then they built it. Now, of course, this gives rise to very interesting ethical questions, which I won't focus on, but any tool that we can imagine can be used for good or bad, right? A hammer can be used to kill somebody or to build a house. An airplane can be used to transport people or to bomb people, right? So the human imagination becomes not only our greatest tool, but also our greatest weapon. So imagination ultimately changes our reality. And I want to argue that our ability to imagine sometimes takes malevolent forms, in the sense that we can see things that are not there, or we can imagine things that are evil. So for example, you can imagine the Incan people saying, well, it has not rained in 5 months, therefore we must have a human sacrifice to please the gods, right? Because we have now this ability to imagine things that a chimpanzee cannot imagine. So I would say that our consciousness, because of this new kind of imagination, became bifurcated. So a chimpanzee lives in its world of its body, in the environment. It feels hunger, it feels desires, it sees the world. But we have that kind of perceptual, motoric, embodied consciousness. And in addition, we have this invisible domain of narrative and imagination that's filling up reality with things that are invisible, that are governing what we see. For example, gods or intentions, or so we have this sort of dual consciousness. But this domain of the imagination gave us this incredible freedom. And the first artifacts that seem to indicate this kind of imagination are actually not that old, right? So this man on the left was found in Germany. It's probably 30 to 40,000 years old. The oldest artifacts, I think, that suggest a change in imagination are no more than 100,000 years old. Some jewelry from the Blombos cave in South Africa suggesting symbolic processing. So our new architecture is probably not that old, probably 100,000 years old, maybe maximum 200,000 years old. there was a change from a concrete form of consciousness of my body in the world with desires to suddenly a new kind of architecture where I could imagine the invisible and create things in my imagination that don't exist. I think this also led to new ways to break down. So for example, just as a bicycle can break, a car can also break, but a car can break in more ways than a bicycle. So our architecture, full of this imagination, can lead to new kinds of breakdown. And for example, there's, as far as I know, no evidence of schizophrenia in chimpanzees or of bipolar disorder in chimpanzees. So things like schizophrenia and bipolar, these psychotic illnesses, are the price we pay as a species for having this highly imaginative architecture. But, you know, this ability to imagine has, in a way, been our greatest tool and our greatest weapon, and it has led to great hubris. I think it began with a kind of demodularization or disencapsulation of previously encapsulated operators. In the brain, I won't talk about the brain so much, but I really think it's very much rooted in a kind of relationship between the volitional circuitry, especially the frontal-parietal control network, and its relationship to the imagination circuitry, especially this internal virtual reality machine that is part of the default mode network. So for the neuroscientists, the posterior cingulate seems to be very central to this internal virtual reality machine that we utilize in imagination. And this design enhancement allowed our hypotheses to die in our stead, right? This new kind of consciousness that we have that chimpanzees don't allowed us to imagine this or this or this, and instead of doing it, we could imagine it and then make mistakes in our mind as opposed to in reality. But, you know, for the purposes of this talk, I really want to focus on this ability to imagine a new kind of self and then make that happen. So, of course, we come to the world with potential. What is genetically given is not an outcome, but a potential. So, for example, you grew up in Spain, I assume, so your mother language is Spanish. But if you had been born in India, your mother language might be Gujarati or Hindi, right? So you were born with a potential to learn any language. A cat does not have the potential to learn a language. So if you raise it around Spanish people or Hindi speakers, it won't learn. So what is genetically given is a potential, and that potential is realized in different ways. One is your environment, your family, but also you yourself play a role in how your potential is realized. If you decide, I want to learn Mandarin, well, you have the potential to learn Mandarin, and you can make a new kind of nervous system in 2 or 3 years that can speak Mandarin. So our own decisions are part of the environment that influences in which direction our genetically given potential will be realized. So our intentions are central to our self-formation. So everything starts with a plan, you know, like Wilbur and Orville Wright had a plan to build an airplane. They didn't know how to do it. They just said, we're going to attach a propeller to a wing, and then the rest of it was work and effort. We have the same imagination. We can apply it to ourselves and imagine a new kind of self in the future. So we can shape the future, starting with our vision and then taking actions to realize that over time. And this can lead to great evil, right? You can have an intention to bomb Russia, or, you know, Russia to bomb us, and this really might happen. You know, this is a possibility. This would be the greatest evil, I think. The Nazis, you know, Hitler was evil in his imagination before he was evil in the world. He really, the Holocaust was first an act of imagination. But it also led to amazing things, like putting somebody on the moon, or the same human capacity to imagine can lead to a dedication to, say, meditation, to transform your nervous system in the direction you want to go, to become more volitionally, attentively controlled. So humans can go in many directions, both good and evil, because of this tremendous power we have. All right, I just want to address some philosophical points and some scientific points in the remaining half of the talk. So let me address the luck argument. So the luck argument basically is that, we have two kinds of luck. One is our constitutive luck. That means our constitution is what we're born with. Right? So Hitler did not choose his genetics, so we can't blame him for any bad things that are due to his genetics. Hitler didn't choose his environment. He was born into Germany, so you can't blame him for his environment. And then there's present luck. And here the idea is that if we're identical before the moment of choosing A or before the moment, choice is random. So that is also not chosen by us. So this luck argument against free will, against libertarian free will, convinces some people. They say, well, we can't blame ourselves for our genetics or environment. We can't blame ourselves for we choose at any given moment. It's like throwing a die, like a dice. Therefore, we have no ability to choose. It's an illusion. And I think the luck argument fails because we are able, in fact, to cultivate in ourselves the bases for the probabilities of our subsequent choices. So this is really the ethics of Aristotle outlined in the Nicomachean Ethics, where a human being becomes virtuous over time by cultivating certain propensities or probabilities for choosing. So that a person becomes virtuous or good by cultivating in themselves a high probability for acting correctly. Anyway, I won't dwell on this too long, but I think there is a way out of the luck argument. There is a way out of the luck argument in that we ourselves agentically shape our nervous system for our future choices. And so, well, just focus on the bottom sentence. We shape the probabilities of future choices by reshaping our nervous system. And I think we reshape our nervous system in many, many ways. Some of these we simply call learning. So if I want to learn Mandarin, I can learn Mandarin. And I actually change my neural circuitry so that it can process Mandarin. Now, it takes 2 or 3 years to become adequate, but I can do it. I start with a vision. I want to learn Mandarin, and then the rest is effort and discipline and work. So really, I think we want to think about how a human being can change their nervous system so they become a different kind of chooser in the future. And again, this happens in many ways. First, I start with a vision. I want to learn Mandarin. I want to have a stronger body. And maybe this takes 6 months or 1 year, but I can do it. I'll go to the gym every day. This is for the body, but it's also true of the mind. And there are many, many ways that the nervous system reshapes itself. You've probably heard of Hebbian learning, where this neuron fire is making this neuron fire, then the connection is strengthened. That's one form of learning called long-term potentiation. Another form of learning happens because of a kind of glial cell called an oligodendrocyte. And these glial cells wrap their arms around axons to the extent that action potentials are going down that axon. So if more action potentials are going down, the oligodendrocyte wraps around the axon more. So we took advantage of this in a study where we actually had people learn Mandarin. So we took, I can't remember how many people, let's say 30 people, and they didn't speak Mandarin, and they studied Mandarin in the Chinese course at my college, 3 semesters. And we looked at how their brains changed their organization over 1 year. And we found that it's called the functional anisotropy, but basically the organization of the brain changed as they learned Mandarin. was a very intensive course. And so we were able to map out changes in axonal organization, probably due to this oligodendrocytes wrapping myelin around the neurons. But that's just one mechanism. There are many, many mechanisms whereby the brain changes itself. And this started with just an act of imagination. I want to learn Mandarin. Okay, and now I think, returning to the luck argument, luck does not just simply happen at an instant. It happens over a very long duration, and there are feedback loops. So if I try something and I fail, I can try again. So let me just give you an example of this, where we make our own luck. So here's Jane Goodall. She was she's very famous. She is the one who discovered that chimpanzees make war, chimpanzees use tools, but she grew up in London in a poor family in the 1930s and 40s. And here she is with her family. She's on, they were not rich. Her mother cleaned houses, but she had this dream to work with chimpanzees in Africa, which seems so improbable. And in the 1940s, people said to her, they said to her, you should just marry somebody and have children like a normal woman. And she said, well, I'm not a normal woman. I want to work in Africa with animals. So she had this very clear vision. And her mother believed in her. Her mother said, you know what, Jane, you're just working in a restaurant as a waitress, but I'm going to clean extra houses and I'm going to help you buy a one-way ticket to Kenya. And so her mother cleaned extra houses and they bought a ticket for her on a boat to go to Mombasa. And then later in life, she said this about her mother. My family has very strong women. My mother never laughed at my dream of Africa, even though everyone else did, because we didn't have any money, because Africa was the dark continent and because I was a girl. So this incredible vision of a poor girl working as a secretary and as a waitress in London, because of her mother's help, she goes to Africa, and then she worked as a secretary in the Nairobi Museum, where she was just, typing, but she was trying to fulfill her dream. She didn't know how she would do it. There she met the great paleontologist, Louis Leakey, who saw her, a very quiet person, and he said, Miss Goodall, would you like to work in the field with me? And so first he let her work at Olduvai Gorge with her, and she was very conscientious. And then he said, you know what, Miss Goodall, can you imagine working with chimpanzees in the wild? And she said, yes, that is why I'm here. So Louis Leakey was surrounded by all these young men who wanted to become the next Louis Leakey. They were like, but that's not the kind of person who can join a chimpanzee troop and just observe. He was looking for a very special kind of person who was quiet and observant. And the rest is history. Her mother then came down and they lived together at the Gombe Preserve, and she observed chimpanzees over many, many years and made many major discoveries and changed our understanding of chimpanzees. This is a good example of making your own luck over a long term. You have a vision and you don't know how it's going to work out, but you just try and try and try. So she's really a hero of mine. And, we often think of opportunism as a negative thing where we take advantage of a situation, but there's also positive opportunism, right? She took advantage of being in Nairobi. She contacted Louis Leakey. She worked for Louis Leakey. And then when the opportunity arose to work with chimpanzees, she grabbed it. So this was a positive opportunism. So I think a lot of things in life take a long time to realize. There's a Chinese saying, build trust 3 years, destroy trust 3 seconds. And in the West, we have an emphasis on decision-making right now, as if it happened at an instant. But so much actually is playing out over years and decades. And if you take the Chinese perspective over generations, so you have to have plans that are 7 generations out in advance. And that makes a difference to how the world turns out. Here she is at the age of maybe 25 in Tanzania. Here she is as an old woman. She's still alive. I got to meet her. So I was so happy to meet my hero. But, you know, as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind, right? So if you're preparing yourself, when the opportunity arises, you can grab it, as she did. So, you know, how do we prepare our minds for future good luck, fortuitous chance? Well, through acts of imagination. For example, she imagined going to Africa, through reparameterizing our life, like actually going to Africa, and then through seizing opportunities when they arise. For example, working for Louis Leakey. So in a way, I think of our lives as a little bit like a garden in which we cultivate our own long-term goals. You know, a garden doesn't happen by chance. It doesn't happen at an instant. It happens over a long duration. You plan this, you plan that, you buy seeds, you know, and we ourselves are like our own garden. So this is a Chinese saying, happiness for 1 hour, a bottle of wine. Happiness for a lifetime, a garden. Our life is like our own garden in which we can cultivate certain things. Okay, Jose, how am I doing with time? Because I can stop at different positions.
Yeah, so we are now arriving almost an hour. I think that 10 minutes, 15 minutes more would be okay, and then we can go through questions and comments if you are comfortable with this.
Yes, okay, so I'll just quickly look at some psychological data that we have looked at about how people can learn new things and actually master things. So like the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, the question is, how do we master our world and how do we master our own minds? So, you know, someone like Vladimir Horowitz or Michael Jordan, they were not masters when they were babies. They were just babies who knew nothing. How did they become Vladimir Horowitz and Michael Jordan? They practiced a lot. They had support from their families. They had natural potential. But we want to understand how human beings can master themselves and their minds. And I think that, you know, we start out mostly incompetent at things. We don't know how to ride a bicycle, for example. And we know that we don't know. And then we say, okay, I want to learn to ride a bicycle. Practice and we think about it and we try. And eventually we become automatized. It's easy to ride a bicycle now. So one question is how this happens in the nervous system. And so in my lab, we have done a lot of experiments to try to look at how people master certain domains. So this is a psychophysical data. This is me looking at a computer. So here's a task. You have to find the one that is different. So in this case, it's easy, right? The red thing just pops out. If you're trichromatic, you should see the red thing with no effort. It announces itself. So that's called the kind of pop out of the feature. The green just pops out. But now if I have a conjunction of shape and green, and you have to find the L, well, this becomes much more difficult. Now you have to move your attention around, and then you can say, oh, there it is. So Anne Treisman noticed that reaction time on the y-axis depends on the number of elements in the display. So the more elements, the longer it takes for this complex sort of display where there are conjunctions of 2 or more features. So, right, so this is easy because it's the only green thing. So in this case, it just pops out. It doesn't matter how many distractors there are, the reaction time is the same. So what I want to argue is that we can train our nervous system to go from this kind of visual search to this kind of visual search with practice, where things just pop out. So this pops out automatically, the vertical thing, but this is very difficult, right? If I say, which is the odd one? Well, there's lots of red vertical things and lots of green things, and but there's only one green vertical thing. So that does not pop out because it is a conjunction And we don't have a specialized set of neurons that are looking just for that. We have to wire them up. So where's the oddball here? This is very difficult for you because you have not trained your nervous system, and I can show you it. The oddball is here. So everything else is red on the right. This is red on the left. So the question is, can we learn to find these things automatically? Can we master this? You know, can we take a feature conjunction like red and round and create specialized detectors in our brains for this? And I want to argue that our attention functions like a kind of glue, and we can hold things together in our working memory, and then they get glued together and they harden. So if you glue together good things, that's your friend. But if you glue together mistakes, then that kind of automatization is your enemy. But this kind of automatization leads us to be able to process things very rapidly without any effort. So you didn't come to the world being able to recognize a stop sign, but now you can because it has been automatized and chunked. So this kind of chunking, this gluing together, affords mastery. And I'm going to, for the interest of time, skip, but basically I'm going to just show you some data. So people start out with search slopes like this. It's very difficult to find the oddball, but over time, so this is observer, just say observer 2. This is on day 1. Their search is slower when there's more distractors, but after 16 days of practice, they become essentially automatic. It doesn't matter how many distractors there are, they can find the one that's red on the right and green on the left. And so this automatization changes their consciousness. Just as a green thing that is unique pops out for you, for them, when they look at this, it pops out for them. Okay, so I'm going to skip a lot of the data, just in the interest of time, and then we can get to discussion. We also did this in time, right? So most of the things we glue together in our awareness are changing not only in spatial relationships, but temporal relationships. So can we glue together things over time to become units or chunks? So in this case, the one on the bottom right just pops out because it's a unique feature. But what if we have a conjunction of features? So this is your target, and this is your distractor. So at any given moment, you have a lot of this on the screen and a lot of this on the screen. So what defines the target is the uniqueness of its combination of features. So for you, because you're not practiced at this, this is difficult. And I can indicate it, it's actually here. So this one is going down then up, and all the other ones are going up then down. But for someone who's highly practiced, this would pop out. So people get, the reaction time goes down, 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 down. And then the question is, how does this generalize, right? So if you learned this target among these distractors, does it generalize? I'm going to go fast. So we're training on this to find this target on the upper left among those distractors on the upper right. And what happens if you switch it? So now what was a target is a distractor, and what was a distractor is a target. Well, at the beginning, people are very slow. It takes, it's very difficult to find the target, but with practice, they become very fast. But now we switch the roles of target and distractor, and people become slow again. Anyway, I'm going to go quickly through this. So if you go in a different direction, does it generalize? Well, you're trained on this, and now you're testing the other direction. So here they start out very slow. After many days of practice, they become very fast at finding the target, and it generalizes to the opposite direction. So they're not learning a unique conjunction of this to this. They're learning something else, something like a pattern. Change the speed. The learning is transferred to slow speeds. The learning is transferred to high speeds. So we're able to generalize. So if you learn, for example, the meaning of a stop sign that's small, it generalizes to a big stop sign, or maybe a different colored stop sign. So we generalize. All right. So, we've been interested in the question of what actually is learned when you learn something. So if you learn this target among this distractor, does it generalize to that? So that would be this. Now for you, this doesn't pop out because you're not trained in this, but this is the oddball here. And we find that if you are trained on this, so finding, say, for example, this among this, and you test now on this, it generalizes, right? So what is actually learned might be something very general, like a kind of abstract pattern, like up followed by down. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. Right, okay, in the last 2 minutes, I just want to talk about a general issue of our nervous system. How do we automatize things that we want to automatize, given that the nervous system is designed to automatize and chunk? We want to automatize things correctly. Now, one danger is that we automatize things incorrectly and we form mistaken ways of thinking, like stereotypes or irrational fears that become an automatic part of our character. I want to argue that we're not an agent with just a single agent. We're more like a hierarchy of agents. And I think in philosophy, there's been relatively little discussion of these mid-level agents and the cultivation of them and the automatization of them, right? So if you look at most organizations like a military or an ant colony or our own minds, it's hierarchical. And there's different levels of agency and because of different levels of decision-making. So if you're Napoleon, you're not going to tell each soldier where to shoot their bullets. That has to be a decision made by the soldier because they have the relevant information. But Napoleon can have the illusion of having total agency if he says, invade Russia, and then all the mid-level and low-level agents agree and they follow. This gives Napoleon the illusion of total control. But once in a while, you might have a renegade commander who disagrees and doesn't follow orders, right? So yes, we have high-level agents, but we also have mid-level agents, and sometimes they disobey, and you can end up with weird situations like alien hand syndrome, which is a bit like a mid-level commander disobeying. Okay, but I do think a lot of what goes into the construction of our agency is the automatization of these mid-level and low-level agents. And we want to form them so that they conform with our intentions and will. And this takes training. And this is very much like the automatization underlying the virtue ethics that Aristotle talks about in the Nicomachean Ethics. And sometimes we automatize mistakes. So you can have a mid-level agent that fires a weapon. You're practicing war games and computer games, and you're firing at enemies, boom, 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 and then you put the person in the real world and they fire at their friend and they kill them. The United States military is suffering from this enormously. Some of the most dangerous people for the American soldiers in Afghanistan were American soldiers shooting in a too liberal way. They're killing each other. Right? Okay, so let me conclude. We have the ability to combine low-level features into chunks. And our attention is central to gluing these things together. Representations, we can put things together and then they form according to what we want to chunk. They become automatized. So if I want to automatize Mandarin, I can study it for 3 years, I can practice it, and then I have automatized Mandarin. If I want to automatize playing the guitar, I can do that too. So my volition is very much connected with my automatization processes. And this ability to automatize decision-making and recognition is centrally related to our ability to master domains, perceptual domains, motoric domains, but ultimately also master aspects of ourself. And so this chunking or automatization process allows us to master the piano or basketball depending on our potential. But I think the most important form of mastery is mastery over our own minds. And this can also be cultivated. So we're given a genetically, we have a genetic potential, but how this genetic potential is shaped is not simply due to the environment in a passive sense. We are active parts of our own environment, and we can choose to shape our potential to learn Mandarin or to learn basketball, or even to become a different kind of person in the future, maybe with different values. You know, we can say, I want to become vegan for moral reasons. Practice being a vegan, maybe I will eventually find meat disgusting, so I can reshape myself in many interesting ways. And so I want to argue that free will is most centrally an issue of first coming up with an imagined scenario, and then the rest of it is effort and work and discipline. And this kind of distal free will rooted in the imagination is very different from the kind of proximal free will that most people think about, you know, choosing this versus this. All right, I'll stop there and take questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter, for this mind-blowing presentation. I loved it. I'm a libertarian too, so maybe this makes things easier, but I loved it anyway. Thank you so much, even more so considering that you have gone recently through COVID, so very much appreciated. You talk about that change favors the prepared mind. This reminds me of Pablo Picasso, who one day said that when inspiration strikes, may it find me working. I think this is the same thing. But anyway, just a very short question. I'm thinking now about the lived style experiments, and one of the premises on which this argument against free will from lived style experiments is based is the idea that we always make unconscious decisions before we are aware of those decisions. And I think that most critics against this kind of argument base their criticism on refuting this premise. But there is a second premise, which is the idea that all automatic decisions are non-free. And I think that a very interesting aspect of your work is that it shows that this is not the case. I mean, those automatic decisions could be genuinely free to the extent that they can be, well, some of them can be the result of long-term, work with yourself, so to speak. I don't know if you agree with that.
But I absolutely agree with this. The Libet work and the Wegner work, I think both of these are built upon, well, first of all, they're both concerning proximal free will, in this case, picking. So in the Libet case, you say, I'm going to move my hand now, or I can say, I'll point with this finger or this finger. But there's no consequence to this, it doesn't matter. But the kinds of decisions that matter for free will, you might call them meta decisions, right? So if I move my hand like this or this, it doesn't matter. I don't care. It has no consequence for my life. But certain decisions have enormous consequences for my life. For example, what country I live in, or if I marry, whom I marry, if I have children, what career I choose. So these are sort of meta decisions that affect everything. And usually to make these kinds of decisions, we don't make a decision instantaneously, we deliberate for a long time. And sometimes we're really torn, right? For example, you might say, well, this potential husband is more handsome than this one, but this one's more intelligent than this one, but this one has more money than this one, but this one has a nicer family. And we can be torn, and we can deliberate for years. Sometimes we're actually tormented. This is a very different kind of decision-making than Libet style decision-making or the Wegner style decision-making, where you're deciding something for no reason, of no consequence, in a very short proximal duration of a couple hundred milliseconds. So I think that the lipid work is simply irrelevant to the question of how we deliberate and imagine, which is taking place over much longer timescales. And another point about Libet is, let's say that Libet and Wegener find that there are illusions of volition, where I think I chose something, but in fact, it was decided not by me, by somebody else or by my unconscious. Well, I would never say, for example, there exist visual illusions, therefore all vision is an illusion. That would be a very strange logical leap. But they're essentially saying that, there are these illusions of volition, and therefore all volition is an illusion. So I think it's a strange logical leap, and it's also mistaken, because they're ignoring the domain where volition really matters, which is the slow distal domain of deliberation. Yeah, so, and also I think that what they are studying also is the feeling of volition. So, for example, why should the feeling of having caused something be the cause of it? Maybe a lot of what we call the feeling of having caused something is about the past. It's retrodictive. So Hugo von Helmholtz was a scientist who came up with a theory about, call it the collateral discharge theory. How we know when we have generated emotion ourselves. So he talked about eye movements. When I move my eyes, well, I have to say, when I move my eyes, I generate a lot of motion across the retina, but I generate it myself, so I want to erase it. So he said there has to be an evaluation of self-caused motion and self-caused consequences. And if we say, I caused that, we erase it. So a lot of this feeling of I caused that might be due to an analysis of what I expect to happen, and then what happened, I compare them, and then I say, I did that. That feeling of I did that is about the past. Of course, anything that's about the past is not going to be causal of the future, right? So in a way, I think Wegener and Libet are probably studying retrodictive about the past feelings of volition, but this is very different from volitional operations which are about the future. For example, where to go to university, what language to learn, whom to marry. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Let's see. Okay.
Yeah. So, do you have questions here in the room, Jose Ignacio? Yep.
Okay, thank you for the seminar, for the conference. It was very interesting. For me, it was very interesting to see your view about free will, speaking about how we shape our future.
The microphone is not working correctly. Maybe you can move to this one.
Yeah.
Will work for sure.
Yeah, I can hear him, but I didn't understand the question.
No, it's the microphone is not working.
The
So
microphone was not working. But that is, if I understand you, you are saying that the future is not a future for our action, for our activity, is not something pre-given, but something we shape to some extent, no? And there we open new possibilities, and so on new opportunities, etc. And this is a very important part of decision of free will of action. One question I have is, you have mentioned once Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, and I wanted to ask you what do you think about the idea of Aristotle about decision, about proeidesis, what he calls proeidesis, because when Aristotle speaks about decision, he says that the typical thing of human beings is that we deliberate, but we decide. But our decision is at the same time a decision for something. We decide to do something, but we decide at the same time a specific way of living. So we decide about ourselves. So each decision, each action is shaping. Not especially, I agree with you, and I think it's the idea of Aristotle, especially those actions that have a long, that are a goal that is far in time, no? That are important, no? And not a decision that is without importance, no? But especially in those decisions that are very important for us and that are important for our future, we not only decide what to do, but at the same time, we are deciding the kind of choosers, and I use your words, we want to be. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think about this, and if you have this in mind?
I'm not familiar with that word that Aristotle used, but I do think it's correct that we choose not only an envisioned future self, but also a path toward that. And I think this is not in Aristotle, and it's also not in most philosophy that I read about free will, because most philosophy that I read about free will is concerned about decision-making at an instant. But most decision-making in biology at every level is cybernetic. It's playing out over durations with feedback. So animals have purposes. This ties in with Aristotle as well. There's different kinds of causation. In the West, especially since the scientific revolution, we have really emphasized the material cause and the efficient cause, but we have tried to eliminate teleology from science. But the problem is that animals are highly teleological, and they have goals. They have hunger, and that's a kind of feedback signal that says you have to find food. They don't know where the food is. They look around, and then, so they're goal-oriented. And finding food for an animal takes time. It can actually take days or weeks. But they're driven by a kind of cybernetic feedback loop. I'm getting closer to my goal. I'm getting farther from my goal. So, Norbert Wiener and other engineers conceived of the cybernetic nature of systems in one way correctly and in one way incorrectly. So they imagined, for example, a missile trying to go to an airplane. So the airplane's going like this, the missile is going here, but then it says there's an error and it corrects it. But now the airplane has moved and it corrects it. So the missile does not actually point to the airplane until the last moment, but there's this dynamic feedback that's leading to error correction. Now, in the case of a cybernetic system made by humans, typically the set point is decided by the engineer. But in biological systems, the set point and the error correction is decided by evolution. So I have feedback that is getting me towards a goal. I might feel lust, so I want to find a mate. I might feel fear, so I want to escape. I might feel hunger, find food. So most decision-making is happening in this very dynamic, cybernetic way with feedback over long durations, even for animals. And so most of the discussion about free will, I think, is making a big mistake in focusing upon decisions being made at an instant when they are in fact not. They're playing out over long durations, sometimes years for humans. But getting to Aristotle, I mean, I think he was very focused on this issue of the automatization of good character. And it is not that a person is born a good person, they become a good person. He said something very interesting. He said, excellence is not a virtue, it is a habit. So we automatize a certain way of thinking, a certain way of being. And this can take very long periods of time. And we don't do this independently. You know, our parents, for example, or our society helps us. It cultivates us. So it's a little bit like scaffolding. So when you build a building, usually you have scaffolding around the building, and it takes a long time to build the building. But when the building is completed, you can remove the scaffolding, and it is as if the scaffolding had never been there. Now, a brain is like this too. We're building a mind. It has great potential, but without the scaffolding of people speaking your mother language, you won't learn a language. You're like these feral children who can't speak. You know, so scaffolding goes into the cultivation of your mind. And then once you have learned your mother language and learned good values from your family, you don't need them anymore. You could live on an island and you can still speak your mother language. But the scaffolding was very important. And I think you would want to add to that the idea that we scaffold ourselves. We can help ourselves become a new kind of person in the future. So maybe now I can't speak Mandarin, but in 3 years I will be able to. Maybe now physically I'm weak, but if I go to the gym every day, I can become stronger. Of course, I cannot scaffold myself into becoming a person who can fly because I don't have the potential for wings. But I can do other things, right? I can learn to use a hang glider. So there's, you know, given my genetically given potential, there's still tremendous freedom to cultivate in ourselves and in each other mastery. But the danger of this tremendous flexibility that allows us to master so many things can also lead to great evil when we have together mistaken ways of thinking, when we have glued together prejudices or stereotypes, or, you know, this imagination we have, which is the source of real free will. I think distal free will also allows us to imagine the Holocaust and nuclear war. So really the battle in ourselves and with other people has to be in this domain of narrative and imagination.
Okay, thanks. So I may have a couple of questions. So first, well, I like very much your proposal of placing the source of free will in imagination rather than, I don't know, in action per se, or in agency and so on. So I was thinking, what kind of mental disorder do you think is more threatening to free will under this understanding? Because one would say, like, for example, addiction is a threat for free will because people, I don't know, they just act as routines and so forth. But concerning your proposal in imagination, maybe one could say that schizophrenia, for example, or mental disorders that are related with delusions and paranoia and so on, are more threatening to free will. So what do you think about that?
Right, so I'm very interested in the volitional operations that operate over the operands in our imagination that allow us then to imagine a new self or a new future for society. But because we have this tremendous ability to carry out operations in this internal virtual reality, gives rise to the great danger, right? One is that we lose volitional control over the operations in our imagination, and we're controlled by, you know, paranoid delusions. Or if we start, so a chimpanzee doesn't have the problem of needing to distinguish what is real from what is imagined, right? So if I look at this pencil, you know, and I say, well, this represents my daughter, I have to hold this in my mind as a thing, but also in my mind, there's a pointer to my daughter. Now a chimpanzee, because it's not really symbolic in a flexible way, won't ever get confused. Now, if I'm holding my daughter and this pencil in my representation of my working memory, I have to say this is real and my daughter is not actually this. But if there's a breakdown and I start to think this is really my daughter, then I go crazy. And so there's many, many ways that this new architecture can lead to really big mistakes, delusions. I think the price we pay for having this architecture is psychosis, is the most extreme form, where you have a total breakdown of real and what is not real. Right? Usually in a normal brain, we say, well, I know that my table is here, this is real, but this other stuff is in my head. That's not real, but I can maintain both. But if you have a breakdown and think what's in your head is real, you can really become completely insane, you know, as happens in psychotic breaks. Yeah, so I think it's not a coincidence that you don't find chimpanzees that have psychosis, because they cannot break in this way. But this is really the price we pay for having our tremendous imaginations and our tremendous power. Really, the important thing is to govern our imaginations so that we use our imaginations for good, for ourselves and for the world. Because it's very easy to start using it for bad, right? So many things, and so many of them are harmful to ourselves, you know, and others. But addiction is another way, you know, that we lose volitional control over our actions, but also our imagination.
Okay, so my other question was, it was about.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah, go, Carlos, and then I'll try to ask mine. That's okay.
Well, thank you, Peter, for such a nice ruminations on all the things you have been working on. But I am still a bit intrigued by the basic problem behind all the things you have said today about the imagination. For example, just to take the imagination on which you have been considered a number of things right now. Even if you, to me, maybe it's my fault, but to me, even if you talk about imagination as something which is on the basis of free will, unless you have some kind of basic downward causation mechanism to allow for it, you still can, I mean, you can speculate that you are just, you know, deluding yourself all the time, okay? And I think that since you wrote in your book on the neural basis of free will about the critical causation as something that is neuronal based, and something that can be an explanation for this downward causation, in which a neuron is responding depending on how the next, the neuron is acting on another neuron, depending on how this other neuron is prepared to receive the message, something like that. Okay, so to what extent this kind of very basic mechanism is still the way you presented it in your book? I mean, do you have some kind of advancements or new ideas or refinements of such a complicated, for sure, but very interesting things you said in the book?
So in that book, so I didn't talk about the kind of free will that separates humans from animals. So that everything that was in that book could be true of a jaguar. So jaguars can also, they also have neurons that not only make the next neuron fire, they also can change the parameters. So this neuron now is tuned to this versus that. In humans, I think that we have that first order free will like a jaguar, but in addition, we have this second order free will, which is we can choose to become a new kind of chooser. We can change our nervous system to become different. And so that's a new thing. It's not only about the neural code, it's about how imagination in particular is central to creating a vision that we can then reshape our nervous system towards. But both ideas, neural reparameterization on a millisecond timescale and neural reparameterization over long time periods involve reparameterization, where we're changing the basis for future decisions, right? So if you go back to David Hume, who said, well, you know, doesn't matter if the universe is deterministic, what you will decide was decided before you were born or predetermined. If it's indeterministic, your decisions are random, and also you have no agency over that. So in that book, I talked about this middle way where the brain can set up the probabilities or the parameters for making future decisions. And so it's not random, because if I say, you know, I can reparameterize you and say, think of a famous actress, and you'll say somebody. Well, it's not random because you didn't, you know, it had to be an actress. You didn't say tree, you didn't say table, right? So I think this kind of reparameterization of B is central to downward causation, both at a neural level and then over scales. And really, what do we mean by downward causation? So I don't think downward causation operates like a force. Downward causation operates like a filter. So there are many possible particle paths that are consistent with the laws of physics, assuming indeterminacy at the basic level of strings or quarks or whatever's at the bottom level. But a subset of those possible physical paths are also possible informational paths. And by setting up these informational filters, you only allow those particle paths that are physically possible, which are also informational paths, to become real. So this is a kind of filtering of what is possible at the quantum domain, such that it is sculpted to match our criteria for what we want to then happen. Yeah, but I do think that all downward causation has to have some basic mechanism for operating. And in the case of the brain, I think it's happening because of rapid synaptic reweighting and slow synaptic reweighting, such that a neuron can be reshaped, such that it, you know, to go back to the billiard ball example, now billiard ball B could say, well, previously I would do this if it was striped and even, but now I'm going to do something else.
Okay, so my other question was about mastery and chunking. So one of our research interests is on habits, and I'm not going into it in depth, but the main idea is that for us, and again, following Aristotle, we argue that habits are not just mere automatisms, rigid automatisms, but they can be also flexible, and they can lead you to actually to mastery and to skills. So I would say, and I don't know if you agree with this, so using your words, that chunking could be the basis of automation, but not necessarily of mastery, and that the basis of mastery would be a flexible chunking. So using the, I mean, I don't know exactly what metaphor use, but I wouldn't use glue, but you know, like something flexible that allows a different assemble of the chunks, right? Like this would be the basis of chunking, of mastery, and the glue is the basis of automatization. That is not, for us, it's not exactly the same.
Yeah, so I think that we can automatize flexible mid-level agents. So they have the ability to make some decision making. So it's not like they are rigid, they can be flexible. So a good example would be driving, right? When I begin to drive, it's very, very difficult. I have to pay a lot of attention, but then I automatize changing the gears, I automatize turning this, I automatize a lot of decision making, and then I can go on the highway and I can make very good decisions that are automatized, but still flexible. I can pass, I can slow down, but this automatization, you can think of it more like schemas of, or programs for decision making. But if something unexpected happens, suddenly, there's animal in the road. So my schema doesn't know how to deal with this, and suddenly I switch out of my, you might call it zombie mode or inattentive mode, into attentive mode, and I switch from automatic to non-automatic. And this transfer into a different, this switch into conscious attentive processing allows me to deliberate. I can say, well, maybe I should slow down, maybe I should open the window, maybe I should honk, right? And I can consider options. So this system is slow, but it's very flexible. It can deliberate. The automatized versions of decision making are typically not that flexible, and they cannot deliberate. So yes, you can automatize agency in a mid-level way, but it cannot handle novelty very well. So we have these two systems. So I agree. I don't think we're automatizing rigid action patterns. I think we can automatize decision making that can be flexible within a domain, but it cannot handle extreme novelty. For that, we have to switch into the slow, attentive mode and consider our options and deliberate. We need both. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you see people who are really masterful at something, like I was watching these people playing ping pong, which is a very fast sport. Bing, 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 bing. I think what I'm watching is two zombie agents playing each other, like their parietal lobe and their parietal lobe. They're completely automatized, and volition at the level of deliberation plays no part. But there is still decision making about where to place the ball and so forth. So I'm not saying that there is no decision making by these mid-level agents that have been automatized, but there is definitely a loss of flexibility. And so this is why automatization, including automatization of decision making and agency, can be your friend, because it allows you to operate very efficiently and fast, but it can also be your enemy if you have automatized bad decision making or mistakes.
Yeah, to these patterns, we call them dispositions, following the Aristotelian term. So yeah, when you have a habit, you are disposed to act like something, but you actually have the free will to act like that or not. If the habit is good, if it's bad, if it's a rigid habit, you are determined to act that way. So that's the way, in a nutshell, that's the way we put it.
Well, this is why I think that scaffolding is so important, right? Having good mentors, good teachers, a good family, a good culture, because this creates our good habits. And if you grow up in a situation where the people around you have bad habits or motivation, already by the age of 5, you're going to have enormous problems, right? And I think any of us who has, I play an instrument. Biggest problem happens when I automatize a mistake. I'll be playing a piece by Bach, and in the same position, I make the same mistake every time because I have automatized the mistake. I think this is also true at the level of automatizing mid-level agents decisions again and again and again, because I have something that is incorrect. For example, many people learn that people tell them you're stupid or you're ugly or you're failure, and then they automatize that way of thinking. And for them, this becomes a huge burden for their whole life. But it's actually the automatization of a mistake.
Okay, Jose Manuel, I think we're done here. So I don't know if we have any other question or over there in the virtual world.
It seems like there's no more questions in the chat. So I think we can go ahead and going home. You are at afternoon in Spain. Maybe you're tired. Peter, thank you so much for being here today with us. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure.
I hope that you get better about these COVID symptoms. And
Oh, I'm better already. This is already my second time, so this is very mild compared
So
to.
it's a habit. It's a habit.
Yeah,
yeah.
no, it's no problem. I think I'm very happy that COVID is mostly finished. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Peter.